Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today, we begin part 2 of Pawn of Prophecy, Cherek. Chapter 12. In the gray first light of the early morning, they rode through the quiet streets of Sendaria to the harbor and their waiting ship. The finery of the evening before had been put aside, and they had all resumed their customary clothes. Even King Cherek and the Earl of Selene had donned plain garb and now resembled nothing quite so much as two moderately prosperous Sendars on a business trip. Queen Layla, who was not to go with them, rode beside her husband, talking earnestly to him with an expression on her face that seemed almost to hover on the verge of tears. The party was accompanied by soldiers cloaked against the raw, chill wind of the sea. At the foot of the street which led down from the palace to the harbor, the stone wharves of Sendaria jutted out into the choppy water, and there, rocking straining against the hawsers which held her, was their ship. She was a lean vessel, narrow of beam and high-prowed, with a kind of wolfish appearance that did little to quiet Garion's nervousness about his first sea voyage. Lounging about on her deck were a number of savage-looking sailors, bearded and garbed in shaggy garments made of fur. With the exception of Cherek, these were the first Chereks Garion had ever seen, and his first impression were that they would probably prove to be totally unreliable. "Cherek!" a burly man halfway up the mast shouted, and dropped hand over hand down a steeply slanting rope to the deck, and then jumped across to the wharf. "Greldick!" Cherek roared in response, swung down from his horse, and clasped the evil-looking sailor in a bear hug. "It would seem that Lord Cherek is acquainted with our captain," the Earl of Selene observed. "That's disquieting," Silk said wryly. "I was hoping for a sober, sensible captain of middle years and conservative disposition. I'm not fond of ships and sea travel to begin with." "I'm told that Captain Greldick is one of the finest seamen in all of Cherek," the Earl assured him. "My lord," Silk said with a pained look, "Cherek definitions can be deceptive." Sourly, he watched Cherek and Greldick toasting their reunion with tankards of ale that had been passed down to them from the ship by grinning sailor. Queen Layla had dismounted, and she embraced Aunt Paul. "Please watch out for my poor husband, Paul," she said with a little laugh that quivered a bit. "Don't let those Alorn bullies goad him into doing anything foolish." "Of course, Layla," Aunt Paul said comfortingly. "Now, Layla," King Cherek said in an embarrassed voice, "it'll be all right. I'm a grown man, after all." The plump little queen wiped her tears. "I want you to promise to wear warm clothes," she said, "and not to sit up all night drinking with Enheg." "We're on serious business, Layla," the king said. "There won't be time for any of that." "I know Enheg too well," the queen sniffed. She turned to Mr. Wolf, stood on her tiptoes, and kissed his bearded cheek. "Dear Belgarath," she said, "when this is over, promise that you and Paul will come back for a long visit." "I promise, Layla," Mr. Wolf said gravely. "The tide's turning, Lord King," Greldick said, "and my ship's growing restless." "Oh dear," the queen said. She put her arms around the king's neck and buried her face in his shoulder. Now, Cherek said awkwardly. "If you don't go now, I'm going to cry right here in public," she said, pushing him away. The stones of the wharf were slippery, and the slim Cherek ship bobbed and rolled in the chop. The narrow plank they had to cross heaved and swayed dangerously, but they all managed to board without accident. The sailors slipped the hawsers and took their places at the oars. The lean vessel leaped away from the wharf and moved swiftly into the harbor past the stout and bulky merchantman anchored nearby. Queen Layla stood forlornly on the wharf, surrounded by tall soldiers. She waved a few times and then stood watching her chin lifted bravely. Captain Greldick took his place at tiller with Beric by his side and signaled to a squat, muscular warrior crouched nearby. The squat man nodded and pulled a ragged square of sailcloth off a high-topped drum. He began a slow beat, and the oarsmen immediately took up the rhythm. The ship surged ahead and made for the open sea. Once they were beyond the protection of the harbor, the swells grew so ponderous the ship no longer rocked, but ran instead down the back of each wave and up the face of the next. The long oars dipped to the rhythm of the sullen drum, left little swirls on the surface of the waves. The sea was lead gray beneath the wintry sky, and the low snow-covered coastline of Sendaria slid by on their right, bleak and desolate looking. Garion spent most of the day shivering in a sheltered spot near the high prow, moodily staring out at the sea. The shards and shambles into which his life had fallen that night before lay in ruins around him. The idea that Wolf was Belgarath and not Paul was Polgara was, of course, an absurdity. He was convinced, however, that a part of the whole thing at least was true. She might not be Polgara, but she was almost certainly not his aunt. He avoided looking at her as much as possible and did not speak to anyone. They slept that night in cramped quarters beneath the stern deck of the ship. Mr. Wolf sat talking for a long time with King Furlick and the Earl of Celine. Garion covertly watched the old man, whose silvery hair and short-cropped beard seemed almost to glow in the light from a swinging oil lamp hanging from one of the low beams. He still looked the same as always, and Garion finally turned over and went to sleep. The next day they rounded the hook of Sendaria and beat northeasterly with a good following wind. The sails were raised and the oarsmen were able to rest. Garion continued to wrestle with his problem. On the third day out, the weather turned stormy and bitterly cold. The rigging cracked with ice and sleet hissed into the sea around them. "If this doesn't break, it'll be rough passage through the bore," Beric said, frowning into the sleet. "The what?" Dernick asked apprehensively. Dernick was not at all comfortable on the ship. He was just recovering from a bout of seasickness, and he was obviously a bit edgy. "The Cherek bore," Beric explained. "It's a passage about a league wide between the northern tip of Sendaria and the southern end of the Cherek Peninsula. Riptides, whirlpools, that sort of thing. Don't be alarmed, Dernick. This is a good ship, and Greldick knows the secret of navigating the bore. It may be a bit rough, but we'll be perfectly safe, unless we're unlucky, of course." "That's a cheery thing to say," Silk observed dryly from nearby. "I've been trying for 3 days not to think about the bore." "Is it really that bad?" Dernick asked in a sinking voice. "I make a special point of not going through it sober," Silk told him. Beric laughed. "You ought to be thankful for the bore, Silk," he said. "It keeps the Empire out of the Gulf of Cherek. All Drasnia would be a Talnidran province if it weren't there." "I admire it politically," Silk said, "but personally, I'd be much happier if I never had to look at it again." On the following day, they anchored near the rocky coast of northern Sendaria and waited for the tide to turn. In time, it slackened and reversed, and the waters of the Sea of the Winds mounted and plunged through the bore to raise the level of the Gulf of Cherek. "Find something solid to hold on to, Garion," Beric advised as Greldick ordered the anchor raised. "With this following wind, the passage could be interesting." He strode along the narrow deck, his teeth gleaming in a broad grin. It was foolish. Garion knew that, even as he stood up and began to follow the red-bearded man toward the prow. But 4 days of solitary brooding over a problem that refused to yield to any kind of logic made him feel almost belligerently reckless. He set his teeth together and took hold of a rusted iron ring embedded in the prow. Beric laughed and clapped him a stunning blow on the shoulder. "Good boy," he said approvingly. "We'll stand together and look the bore right down the throat." Garion decided not to answer that. With wind and tide behind her, Greldic's ship literally flew through the passage, yawning and shuddering as she was seized by violent riptides. Icy spray stung their faces, and Garen, half blinded by it, did not see the enormous whirlpool in the center of the bore until they were almost upon it. He seemed to hear a vast roar, and cleared his eyes just in time to see it yawning in front of him. "What's that?" he yelled over the noise. "The great maelstrom," Beric shouted. "Hold on!" The maelstrom was fully as large as the village of Upper Gralt, and descended horribly down into a seething, mist-filled pit, unimaginably far below. Incredibly, instead of guiding his vessel away from the vortex, Greldic steered directly at it. "What's he doing?" Garion screamed. "It's the secret of passing through the bore," Beric roared. "We circle the maelstrom twice to gain more speed. If the ship doesn't break up, she comes out like a rock from a sling, and we pass through the riptides beyond the maelstrom before they can slow us down and drag us back." "If the ship doesn't what?" "Sometimes a ship is torn apart in the maelstrom," Beric said. "Don't worry, boy, it doesn't happen very often, and Greldic's ship seems stout enough." The ship's prow dipped hideously into the outer edges of the maelstrom, and they then raced twice around the huge whirlpool, with the oarsmen frantically bending their backs to the frenzied beat of the drum. The wind tore at Garion's face, and he clung to his iron ring, keeping his eyes averted from the seething maw gaping below. And then they broke free and shot like a whistling stone through the churning water beyond the maelstrom. The wind of their passage howled in the rigging, and Garion felt half suffocated by its force. Gradually, the ship slowed in the swirling eddies, but the speed they had gained from the maelstrom carried them onto calm water and partially sheltered cove on the Sendarian side. Beric was laughing gleefully and mopping spray from his beard. "Well, lad," he said, "what do you think of the bore?" Garion didn't trust himself to answer, and concentrated on trying to pry his numb fingers from the iron ring. A familiar voice rang out from the stern. "Garion!" "Now you've gone and got me in trouble," Garion said resentfully, ignoring the fact that standing in the prow had been his own idea. Aunt Paul spoke scathingly to Beric about his irresponsibility, and then turned her attention to Garion. "Well," she said, "I'm waiting. Would you like to explain?" "It wasn't Beric's fault," Garion said. "It was my own idea. There was no point in their both being in trouble after all." "I see," she said. "And what was behind that?" The confusion and doubt which had been troubling him made him reckless. "I felt like it," he said half defiantly. For the first time in his life, he felt on the verge of open rebellion. "You what?" "I felt like it," he repeated. "What difference does it make why I did it? You're going to punish me anyway." Aunt Paul stiffened and her eyes blazed. Mr. Wolf, who was sitting nearby, chuckled. "What's so funny?" she snapped. "Why don't you let me handle this, Paul?" the old man suggested. "I can deal with it," she said. "But not well, Paul," he said. "Not well at all. Your temper's too quick and your tongue's too sharp. He's not a child anymore. He's not a man yet, but he's not a child either. The problem needs to be dealt with in a special way. I'll take care of it." He stood up. I insist, Paul." "You what?" "I insist." His eyes hardened. "Very well," she said in an icy voice, turned and walked away. "Sit down, Garion," the old man said. "Why is she so mean?" Garion blurted. "She isn't," Mr. Wolf said. "She's angry because you frightened her. Nobody likes to be frightened." "I'm sorry," Garion mumbled, ashamed of himself. "Don't apologize to me," Wolf said. "I wasn't frightened." He looked for a moment at Garion, his eyes penetrating. "What's the problem?" he asked. "They call you Belgarath," Garion said, as if that explained it all. "And they call her Polgara. So? It's just not possible. Didn't we have this conversation before, a long time ago?" "Are you Belgarath?" Garion demanded bluntly. "Some people call me that. What difference does it make?" "I'm sorry," Garion said. "I just don't believe it." "All right," Wolf shrugged. "You don't have to if you don't want to." "What's that got to do with your being impolite to your aunt?" "It's just," Garion faltered. "Well," desperately, he wanted to ask Mr. Wolf that an ultimate fatal question, but despite his certainty that there was no kinship between him and his Aunt Paul, he could not bear the thought of having it finally and irrevocably confirmed. "You're confused," Wolf said. "Is that it? Nothing seems to be like it ought to be, and you're angry with your aunt because it seems like it has to be her fault?" "You make it sound awfully childish," Garion said, flushing slightly. "Isn't it?" Garion flushed even more. "It's your own problem, Garion," Mr. Wolf said. "Do you really think it's proper to make others unhappy because of it?" "No," Garion admitted in a scarcely audible voice. "Your aunt and I, who we are," Wolf said quietly. "People have made up a lot of nonsense about us, but that doesn't really matter. There are things that have to be done, and we're the ones who have to do them. That's what matters. Don't make things more difficult for your aunt just because the world isn't exactly to your liking. That's not only childish, it's ill-mannered, and you're a better boy than that. Now, I really think you owe her an apology, don't you?" "I suppose so," Garion said. "I'm glad we had this talk," the old man said. "But I wouldn't wait too long before making up with her. You wouldn't believe how long she can be angry." He grinned suddenly. "She's been angry with me for as long as I can remember. And that's for so long that I don't even like to think about it." "I'll do it right now," Garion said. "Good," Wolf approved. Garion stood up and walked purposely to where Aunt Paul stood staring out at the swirling currents of the Cherek Boar. "Aunt Paul?" he said. "Yes, dear. I'm sorry I was wrong." She turned and looked at him gravely. "Yes," she said, "you were. I won't do it again." She laughed then, a low, warm laugh, and ran her fingers through his tangled hair. "Don't make promises you can't keep, dear," she said, and she embraced him, and everything was all right again. After the fury of the tide through the Cherek Boar had abated, they sailed north along the snow-muffled east coast of the Cherek Peninsula toward the ancient city, which was the ancestral home of all Alorns, Algar and Drasnian, as well as Cherek and Riven. The wind was chill and the skies threatening, but the remainder of the voyage was uneventful. After 3 more days, their ship entered the harbor at Val Alorn and tied up at one of the icy, shrouded wharves. Val Alorn was unlike any Sendarian city. Its walls and buildings were so incredibly ancient that they seemed more like natural rock formations than the construction of human hands. The narrow, crooked streets were clogged with snow, and the mountains behind the city loomed high and white against the dark sky. Several horse-drawn sleighs awaited them at the wharf, with savage-looking drivers and shaggy horses stamping impatiently in the packed snow. There were fur robes in the sleighs, and Garion drew one of them about him as he waited for Beric to conclude his farewells to Greldick and the sailors. "Let's go," Beric told the driver, and he climbed into the sleigh. "See if you can't catch up with the others." "If you hadn't talked so long, they wouldn't be so far ahead, Lord Beric," the driver said sourly. "That's probably true," Beric agreed. The driver grunted, touched his horses with his whip, and the sleigh started up the street where the others had already disappeared. Fur-clad Cherek warriors swaggered up and down the narrow streets, and many of them bellowed greetings to Beric as the sleigh passed. At one corner, their driver was forced to halt, while 2 burly men, stripped to the waist in the biting cold, wrestled savagely in the snow in the center of the street, to the encouraging shouts of a crowd of onlookers. "A common pastime," Beric told Garion. "Winter's a tedious time in Val Alorn." "Is that the palace ahead?" Garion asked. Beric shook his head. "The Temple of Balar," he said. "Some men say that the bear god resides there in spirit. I've never seen him myself, though, so I can't say for sure." Then the wrestlers rolled out of the way, and they continued. On the steps of the temple, an ancient woman wrapped in ragged woolen robes stood with a long staff clutched in one bony hand, and her stringy hair wild about her face. "Hail, Lord Beric," she called in a cracked voice as they passed. "Thy doom still awaits thee." "Stop the sleigh," Beric growled at the driver, and he threw off his fur robe and jumped to the ground. March ye, he thundered at the old woman. "You've been forbidden to loiter here. If I tell Enheg you've disobeyed him, he'll have the priests of the temple burn you for a witch." The old woman cackled at him, and Gary noted with a shudder that her eyes were milk-white blackness. "The fire will not touch old Martjay," she laughed shrilly. "That is not the doom which awaits her." "Enough of dooms," Beric said. "Get away from the temple." "Martjay sees what she sees," the old woman said. "The mark of thy doom is still upon thee, great Lord Beric. When it comes to thee, thou shalt remember the words of old Martjay." And then she seemed to look at the sleigh where Garion sat. Though her milky eyes were obviously blind, her expression suddenly changed from malicious glee to one of strangely awestruck. "Hail, greatest of lords!" she crooned, bowing deeply. "When thou comest into thine inheritance, remember that it was old Martjay who first greeted thee." Beric started toward her with a roar, but she scurried away, her staff tapping on the stone steps. "What did she mean?" Garion asked when Beric returned to the sleigh. "She's a crazy woman," Beric replied, his face pale with anger. "She's always lurking around the temple, begging and frightening gullible housewives with her gibberish. If Enheg had any sense, he'd have had her driven out of the city or burned years ago." He climbed back into the sleigh. "Let's go," he growled at the driver. Garion looked back over his shoulder as they sped away, but the old blind woman was nowhere in sight.